Welcome everyone to episode 59 from X-Ways Clips. Firstly, another apology because as you can see from the website here, I promised back in March 2019 that I would make this video, but it's taken me quite a long time for various reasons, mostly kind of domestic based. If I've got my kids running around in the background or whatever, it doesn't always make for conducive video production. So I'm going to have a stab at it now that I've got a little bit of time to try and do this. So video 59 aims to be a simple, quick introduction to something that I'm asked about a lot, which is the extensions for X-Ways Forensics. So extensions were introduced into X-Ways Forensics some years ago, and they are a means for anyone with a professional programming ability to extend the functionality of X-Ways Forensics in a bespoke way that suits their specific needs. So very similar conceptually, at least, to a lot of the other forensic tools which allow you to write various scripts and things to extend the functionality of those tools. The difference with extensions to the others is that the aim is to create a compiled DLL, dynamic link library, that X-Ways Forensics calls, and as a result of doing that, you create a machine code compiled, essentially an executable, but an executable in which only X-Ways Forensics can use. So it runs really, really quick, and all the code that you write will be executed as proper machine code, so it will work really well, as long as it's subject to your programming abilities, of course. So the first thing is you obviously need the extension API. API means application programming interface, and it is a set of functions and rules which allow you to write functions to do certain things, and X-Ways Forensics can call those functions as and when you dictate that it should, and equally X-Ways Forensics calls functions that it knows about as and when it knows it should. So there's a few rules about that discussion which I'll get to shortly, but the first thing that you will need to do is download the actual API, which you can get from the X-Ways Forensics website. If you go to the main page and do a search for the API section, you'll be shown this page here, which gives you quite a lot of information about the actual API itself, including some choice of programming languages which it points out you may or may not want to consider using. So the beauty of extensions is that you can pretty much use any programming language you like, as long as you can compile it into a DLL. So obvious examples would be C and C++, any kind of Delphi or Pascal variant. They specifically link to Free Pascal, which is what I'm going to be showing you how to use here. And if anyone writes in the comments, I used to use Free Pascal when I was at school, whatever, it's been around a while. Well, Turbo Pascal has been around a while. Free Pascal has been around for a decent amount of time, maybe 10 years plus. But Free Pascal is an object-orientated, open source, free version, if you like, of Delphi. Delphi being the commercial version of object-orientated Pascal. It works really well. It enables you to do pretty much anything from the bit level to, massive arrays, blah, blah, blah. But you don't have to use that. You can use Visual Studio and some others. Python isn't natively allowed because of its interpreted nature, but there is, I believe, it mentions somewhere in here about some kind of port that enables you to use Python to be able to do this as well. So for this demonstration, like I've explained, it's going to be Free Pascal orientated. The concept is the same regardless of the syntax, so don't start stressing about different syntax. You just need to apply whatever syntax I show you to your particular programming language. So I recommend, in order to use Free Pascal best, you can use the Lazarus IDE, which is very similar to the Delphi IDE. You can download it from here, lazaruside.org. Just click download and it will download the latest one for Windows and install everything it needs pretty much with your eyes shut. There is one thing to add, and that's if you want to create 32-bit versions of your extensions to run with the 32-bit version of X-Ray Forensics, you can get a 32 to 64-bit cross-compiler, which when you go to the downloads page for Lazarus, you'll see Lazarus Windows 64 bits. In here there's the native installer for 64-bit Windows, but down here there's an additional add-on, which if you download and run that and install it to the same place where your main Lazarus installation is installed, it will add the additional bits and pieces that it needs to compile 32-bit versions of your extension. So I'm not going to waste time doing all that. I've already done it. So once you've downloaded that and you've downloaded the API, which by the way is further down here where under API downloads, there are some demos that come with the source code as well as the actual API itself. So to follow along with this demo, you would need the Delphi functions, definitions, and 5 sample projects. So if I just minimize the web browser for a moment. So I've already installed Lazarus. Once it's installed, you get an icon similar to this, and it will load to a default dialog like so. So up here you've got all the various common elements that you would expect with a programming IDE. So in order to create an extension, remember we need to essentially create a DLL. So if I go on new project, one of the options in here is library, and it even says a Free Pascal shared library brackets DLL under Windows, and you can do the same thing for Linux and Mac, but no, I'm not going to cover that. So you click OK to that, and it gives you essentially a blank canvas for you to start working on. Now there's a couple of things about this which I'll explain kind of now and kind of as we go through. I'll explain this bit shortly. In the meanwhile, we have the library name, so this is essentially the name of your DLL or the name of your extension. You can just leave it as project 1 for purposes of demonstration. Uses is the equivalent of your imports section in C. Basically, it's what libraries you want to use. So Free Pascal comes with hundreds of pre-installed libraries which contain hundreds and thousands of functions and so on that you can use. And you can and we will need to add a few here as we go. And then you've got a begin and an end, which for the purposes of this demonstration stays at the end. There's a few other bits that we'll be adding shortly. So we'll soon be adding a var section, which means variables, which in this context will be global variables, which is a little bit frowned upon generally speaking in programming terms, but again for the purposes of demonstration it works okay. You then have your various functions that you will write. They are the functions that will talk to and from X-Ray Forensics. You then have an exports section where we essentially export the functions that we need X-Ray Forensics to be able to access. You don't need to export all your functions, just the ones that X-Ray Forensics needs. Okay, so the first thing to do is to save this blank project. So I'm going to save it to where my extension demo is. So project 1, LPI is the Lazarus program interface basically. So it just creates a small folder in there. Sorry, not a folder, some files. So you can basically just double click that LPI file to carry on where you've left off each time as you go. and the main code that you're writing is saved in the LPR file, which is the project file, and don't need to worry about LPS. So you'll notice in here that there's this file, xt_api.pass. That is your extension API file that any project that you write in any language, as far as I'm aware, will need to be able to find. If the DLL isn't kind of linked to that, the functions won't make any sense. It won't understand what functions you're trying to call. So basically, when I downloaded the Delphi functions definitions in here, in addition to all the other demo projects, there is the xt_api.pass file. So you need to copy that to wherever you've saved your project to. Once you've done that, your project can find the API once you specify it in here. So the API is effectively, for all intents and purposes, a library. It's just not one that's installed with Free Pascal. So under uses, I'm going to add a comma and type in here xt_api. The thing between the blue curly brackets is comment, so it just ignores that, and then it finds the semicolon at the end, which means the end of the line. If I add more units here, I need to separate them with a comma, but for now I don't need to. I just need XTAPI. Now I've done that, if I just quickly just go save project, now when I press, did that a bit quick, let me go back and do that again. If I press the control key with my mouse key hovered over that, and you'll see even before I press anything that the Lazarus IDE is already detecting that this is linked to xtapi.pass. So if I press the control key, you'll notice you get a hyperlink to it, and when I click it, it opens the XTAPI itself. So in here is all the information about the API which the developers there at XOS Forensics have done in advance. This is the API itself, and there's all sorts of bits and pieces in there that might look somewhat intimidating to start with, but some of them will make sense as we carry on. The quick explanation for now is that a lot of these are values which are passed or included with various functions within the API. So for example, these ones here control the way in which a extension is executed within XOS Forensics, because you can run it from several places. You can run it from the directory browser, you can run it from the refining volume snapshot, and so on. And these values basically tell XOS Forensics in what way the extension is to be called. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a bit. Okay, so a few other units that we need to add in order for the rest of this demo to work, and some of these kind of things you learn as you go. We've already got classes, as we know. We've got XTAPI. The other ones that we're going to need for this demonstration is the Windows unit. Oh God. And the sysutils unit. And again, you don't need to click on these, but as you can see, if they're valid, they get linked when you press the control key. Okay, so there's some of the libraries that I'm going to have to use as part of this. So then we get to some basic functions. Now, within the XOS Forensics extension API, there are a myriad of functions. However, there are some core ones which you kind of need in order to build a basic extension. And this is what a lot of people find intimidating, I think, about the API itself. And that is, oh, sorry, just bear with me. Where am I going? yeah, you've got functions that start with xt underscore, and you've got functions that start with xwf underscore. And it's important to know the difference between those two. Basically, the ones that start xt underscore are functions that Xways Forensics will specifically call in an order that it decides is suitable. This will become more clear as we go on, but I don't want to confuse you just now. The xwf underscore functions are functions that you as the programmer can call. In other words, you call the function asks Xways Forensics for information based on that function, and Xways Forensics returns the answer to your function. Whereas xt underscore functions, Xways Forensics basically drives. So it's designed to call various core functions in a specific kind of order, but that order is also dependent on some parameters that you set within them. It sounds really confusing at this stage, but it will become more clear as we go on. So the few core ones that I want to mention to you are, in fact, if I can find them in here, it will make more sense. So we have XTinit, basically initialize. We have XTAbout, which is like an about window that will tell the user information about that particular extension. You need XTPrepare, which is the function that Xways Forensics uses in order to prepare itself before it then goes on to do the more in-depth things. You then have XTProcessItem, which is the function that's necessary in order to do whatever it is you want to do with each item in your case. And that can be called iteratively or for certain selected items or various other means. You've then got XTFinalize, which is just above it up here, which isn't essential. You don't have to use it. It's just I always generally do, even if you don't really do anything. I sometimes use it as like a placeholder, which it just gives you some time to release any memory and things like that you might be utilizing. And then the final one is XTDone, which is somewhere in here, I think. Yeah, XTDone. So that is called last by Xways Forensics, and basically concludes the execution. And Xways Forensics, I'm assuming, will then clear whatever it needs to clear to make sure there's no memory leaks and things like that. Now, one of the key points with a lot of these functions is to make very close attention to what has been described or stated as the return values. I make that point because I spent a considerable amount of time one day, well, for several days, trying to work out why something wasn't working. It was compiling fine, it would execute within Xways Forensics, but it wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. And that was because I'd forgotten to add at the end the return value, i.e. the result. And as soon as I added the result, it worked. The general rule is that all this information in here, which looks a bit overwhelming, but it is all there for a reason. We all know how good the guys at Xways Forensics are with their development and their overall approach to software development. Nothing is mentioned if it doesn't need to be mentioned, and everything is precisely put there for a precise reason. The amount of times I've looked and looked in here trying to work out what an answer or an explanation is, and I've eventually given in and asked Stefan, and he's replied back and he's quoted the sentence from the relevant part of this documentation, which in the context then make sense. So if the answer isn't obvious, don't just buckle and start asking for help. Just keep reading. Read the entire thing if you have to. The answer will be in there somewhere. Okay, so back to our demonstration. So I've cheated a little bit in that I've written some functions already for the purposes of demonstration, but I'll pull them in one at a time rather than en masse to help you understand a bit better. So I'm going to change the second line in a bit, but I want to show you first what happens when you don't change that. So I'll come back and explain that a little bit later. So I'm just going to add my global variables, which we're going to need for this section. So global variables go after the uses section in here, and they just start with var. So var means whatever appears next is a row of global variables, which means any function within this library will be able to call these functions. Again, the syntax for this might vary between one language and another, but this is basically a date value, so I want it to be of type tDateTime. This is what could potentially be a very large value, so that is a 64-bit integer. And this is a handle that is needed by Xways Forensics in order for us to access the main window of the program. Okay, so that's the global variable section. So the next function, like we've already described, is the initialization function. So this is the first function that Xways Forensics will call when it calls when you ask Xways Forensics to run one of your extensions. And it will pass, Xways Forensics will pass the function various bits of information. So included with that is the version of Xways Forensics that's been run by the user, along with some handles and some pointers and a few other bits and bobs. And its return value is an integer. So basically this function has to return a number in order for it to work, essentially. And this little example is taken essentially from one of the demo, it's a portion from one of the demos that you get within the API. But in this case, it's basically saying that if the main window is there and present and it works, then we can run. Otherwise, we don't want to run, and we return -1. If it returns -1 in here, then you'll get an error message from Xways Forensics basically saying I can't run this extension. You can do other stuff, so you can specifically look up in here what the version is that's been passed. So with each version of Xways Forensics, new functionality becomes available, and it might be that you've written your extension to only run with a certain version or higher. So you might want to say in here, if n version is less than version 16.8, then tell the user that I can't run, for example. I'm not going to go into that too much more, but just suffice to say, in order to get yourself with a basic functional extension, you need this function in here, and it needs to be first. Okay, the next one is the about window. So I shall put that in here. So again, this is the about window. So when you click the little ellipsis in an extension dialog within Xways Forensics, it will give you the information in a little dialog window. So you might want to pass in here information to tell the user what the extension is for, under what condition it's supposed to be run, so on and so forth. And again, the result must be 0. If I just go back to the API for a moment and find XTAbout, that might make a bit more sense. So if exported will be called when the user requests the information about the DLL, blah, 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 you should return 0. So this is what I mean about saying pay attention to this information here about what's returned. Okay. So the next one is, is XTPrepare. So this is where things start getting a little bit more in depth. Okay, so XTPrepare, again, remember these are all ones that XWays Forensics is calling, not you as the developer. So XWays Forensics is saying, right, okay, so I've run the initialization function, that's okay. I've run the about function, that's okay. Now I need to prepare myself to do whatever's going to come next. And that involves passing some information. So for example, these two here are handles that XWays Forensics passes the extension internally to the evidence objects that the user is currently selecting or that the user has asked to be selected. So if, for example, your extension has been designed to run from the volume snapshot, when the user clicks, the evidence objects, it might be that you want to run, or you want the user to run this extension across everything in a single case, or it might only be that it's designed to run on one selected evidence object. Either way, XTPrepare is where the handle comes from, and you can then address that evidence object by effectively addressing hvolume or hevidence. There's some other bits and pieces that comes with it, some of which isn't necessarily needed, but it's there anyway. And pointers are slightly different to normal variables. They're pointers to where information is stored, and can often be a bit, or quite a lot faster than using static variables. And it returns an integer as well. So if we go to XTPrepare in the help again, you will see that you've got the function name here, and then it tells you what information is within that function, or essentially what comes with it. And then when you go to the help over here, you can read up about what this information actually means. So if we take NOP type, for example, down here it will say NOP type, how the extension is executed within XWays Forensics. So if NOP type has returned 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or it could actually even be these corresponding textual representations, it will basically say the extension has been run by the user right-clicking, or it's been run through the RVS. So during XTPrepare, you can ask the function to check in what way the function was called and whether that complies with the way that you want it to be run. So if you wanted your extension to only run by the user right-clicking some selected files, for example, and not to be run through refine volume snapshot, you could say, well, if NOP type equals 4, then run. Otherwise, show him a message that it has to be run the way I've asked it to be run and bail out. That's basically how that bit would work, because you've got the corresponding explanations here that tell you what each value actually means. So in my case, in this example, I've put that in there as some extra help. So I've got my function XTPrepare. I've got a couple of variables that are local to the function XTPrepare, which are basically centered around output messages for the user. I've got that tDateTime variable that was a global one that was declared at the top, and I'm saying basically at the time that we're running, store that in start time. So this is for a timer for later on. I then do a statement to check what NOP type is. So if it's, this is basically saying that if the value of NOP type is anything other than 4, then you need to tell the user that you can't go on and exit, which is -3 or -3. So if we just go back into here, I think it does tell you that somewhere specifically. Where is it? Yeah, possible negative return values. So if it returns -4, if you want XOS Forensics to stop the whole operation, -3 if you want to prevent further use of the extension for the remainder of the whole operation, -2 if you want this particular volume excluded from the operation, -1 if you don't want any other functions of this extension to be called. Okay, so that's why I've put in -3. If it's anything other than 4, then don't run, is basically what it's saying. Otherwise, if it is 4, then please return the result for XTPrepare. The result that we want to be in this particular extension is to call process item. So you might be saying, well, where did you just get call process item from that value there? XTPrepare call PI is the return value that corresponds to, if we find it here, positive return values are a combination of these flags, call PI, and it goes down here to explain them. So in here, look, XTPrepare call PI. If you want XOS Forensics to call your implementation of XTProcessItem, whichever is exported, for each item in this volume snapshot, you might want to call it late. So you might want to say call process item, but do it later on, because XOS Forensics might need to do something with those items before it calls it. You've got expect more items, you've put don't omit, you've got target directories, and you've got target 0-byte files. So you can use, you basically need to have pretty much call PI for call process item, either on its own or by ORing with these other values here. So you might want to call every item, but also include target 0-byte files. In this simple example, we're not going to start messing about trying to find 0-byte files and stuff as well. We're just going to process every item. However, another important thing to bear in mind is that the way that XOS Forensics considers each item needs to be considered, and to do that you often need to read the whole user manual or be well versed in how XOS Forensics actually works. So for example, a file of 0 bytes is generally considered by XOS Forensics to be not of much use, and so it won't do anything with that. It won't process that item, and it doesn't do that within XOS Forensics when you refine the volume snapshot either. If it knows it's 0 bytes file, it's not going to start trying to do all sorts of magic with it through its volume snapshot refinement. So understanding those native core methods of how XOS Forensics works is also important in the development of extensions. So the development of extensions isn't necessarily for the light of heart. You kind of really need to know how XOS Forensics operates in order to write them effectively. Okay, so that's XTPrepare. So what this function will do when XOS Forensics calls it, it will basically tell your extension, this is the volume handle that I want you to look at. I want you to store the start time in this variable here. I want you to check that the NOP type is of an acceptable value for me to continue. And if all of that is the case, then the next thing I want XOS Forensics to do is to call process item. Okay, so the next one is therefore to call XTProcessItem. And this is where the real nuts and bolts of extensions really comes to the fore, because it's within this function where for every single item that XOS Forensics processes, and that might be everything in the snapshot, or it might be the files that have been selected by the user and the user's right-clicked and gone run extension. These are all decisions that you need to make as the developer. But whatever it does with that item, this is where you get pretty much no holds barred full freedom to effectively create your own program to do all sorts of wonderful magic. So it might be, as a developer, you've already developed standalone tools to do all sorts of magic with data. Using this, you can take a lot of the stress out of things like working out how to open an EO1 image and find certain offsets of partitions and things like that. You can forget all of that and then just concentrate on what you want to do with particular forensic artifacts within the case. So XTProcessItem is another one of the core functions called by X-Ways Forensics, and it will, for every item that's to be examined, it will pass the item ID, and this is not necessarily the unique ID. Well, it is the unique ID, but it's not prefixed with the partition separator. So for each partition, it will numerically provide an ID for each item, but it also prefixes it with the number of the partition. However, you need to do some concatenation with some other functions to get that full unique ID. So if you need to output that into a report or whatever, but for the purposes of processing the item within the evidence objects that X-Ways Forensics has just told the function that it's going to look at. So let's say, for example, it's partition 1 of evidence object 1. X-Ways Forensics knows the handle to that evidence object 1 and to that partition 1, and so then it's just going to pass the item ID for each item in that particular partition and do everything with it. And again, it also returns an integer value. So here we've got a constant, which is basically, in my case, I just want to allocate 255 bytes for a small buffer. I've then got some variables. The general concept for strings within an extension to be used with X-Ways is that you need to use wide character arrays, essentially Unicode UTF-16, because that's essentially what Windows uses by default, which means that for every letter you've got 2 bytes rather than 1 byte, and you might need to do some conversions between Unicode and so on. So in here I've got a few of these what are defined in Free Pascal anyway as wide char arrays, and each one can't be any bigger than 255. I've then got some small 32-bit integers that I need to use. I've then got a 64-bit integer that I want to use. I've got a handle that I need to use, and I've got a wide string that's essentially a pointer, and that's for my file name. So we then hit the begin and the end of this particular function. I just declare item size as -1 before we get going into anything. And then the first thing I do is ask for the item size of the particular item that it's currently looking at. Now remember, XTProcessItem is called iteratively for every item that's been selected or that's been targeted for analysis. So again, going back to how the extension is called, that could vary. It could be millions of items within a particular case, or it could be a selection of items. Either way, it will do it for every single item that X-Ways Forensics knows about until there are no more to do. Once there are no more to do, it will call the final functions, in this case XTFinalize and XTDone. So it's called iteratively. So every time this will run, item size will be set to -1. It will then look up the item size using a function that I'm calling as the developer. Now this is where it goes the other way around. I'm now using the API to say, to ask X-Ways Forensics, tell me how big the item is that I'm currently looking at, and store it in this variable called item size, which is why item size has to be 64-bit, because that could be a really large number, bearing in mind the value is in bytes. And it will tell you, if you want to look up the specific function, if you go to, I think it's in this section, yeah, XWF get item size. retrieves the size of the item, file or directory in bytes. So, it doesn't leave you guessing. It tells you what the value is. So you know that these could potentially be massive numbers. If it returns -1, then it means X-Ways Forensics doesn't know the size. And again, with all of these functions, it tells you at the start what value is returned by it and what values need to be given within it. So in this case, XWF get item size. It needs to know the item ID that you want to look up, and it will return a 64-bit integer. And that's the same concept for all of these functions that start XWF. Remember, they're the functions that you as the programmer ask X-Ways Forensics to give you information about. Okay, so assuming that, so that's either going to end up being -1 if there is no file size available, or it's going to be some value above 0. So then I say, if item size is bigger than 0, i.e. if there appears to be a valid file size to work with, then do some stuff. So the first thing I want to do is I want to increment total data in bytes by the amount of bytes that this item is said to be. So iteratively, total data in bytes will get bigger and bigger and bigger every time XTProcessItem is run. So again, if there's millions of files in here, that number is going to get enormous. We've then got, I then want to convert that item size into a string value. I then want to ask X-Ways Forensics for the file name of this particular item that I'm looking at. So item ID, it could be 1, 10, 25, 1000, whatever item it is, I want to know what file name it is. So XWF get item name of the item ID, and it will store that in this Unicode wide string variable, which I can then output to the user. Once I've got that, I can then output this information using the X-Ways Forensics default message system, which is XWF output message. Before I do that, though, I just need to do some jigging around. Not necessarily always essential, but it's always best to use null terminated strings within this environment. So I basically copy, just here I've concatenated my message to basically say, create a line that's got the file name plus the text size and then the string representation of the item size for this particular file, and stick it all in a new variable called output message. And I then copy output message into a buffer, and then I output that buffer using this syntax here. And then after it's done all that, I return 0. If return 0 isn't done, you may find that XTProcessItem doesn't do what you expect it to do. Okay, so next we'll add in fact, I'll go through these last two fairly quickly because I'm a bit worried I might not end up with much time or disk space at this rate. So I'll just copy these two in here. So XT finalize, again, same concept. This is a function that X-Ways Forensics is calling, and it's passing the extension, the active volume, some other information, and it expects and returns, or it expects its result to be an integer. So similar concept here. I've got some local variables. I've now got an end time in here, which is of tdate time as well. So now that we're about finished, I've got it to record the end time of now, which could be some seconds, minutes, or hours later. I've then done some formatting of the start and end time. Start time being a global variable up the top, you remember. End time newly computed. And then another output message in the same way as before to be output into the message window of X-Ways Forensics to say extension executed ended at and it will format the datetime. This is free Pascal based syntax. You can look up your appropriate syntax yourself for whichever system you choose to write the extensions with. And then lastly, we've got function xt done, which I've just got result equals 0 in. Like the comments here say, it gives XWays Forensics a chance to get rid of anything that it needs to get rid of. So I could add some stuff in there if I needed to, and it also just allows XWays Forensics its time to do what it needs to do. Okay, so that is basically it for a basic function. Now, if I try and compile this, what should happen is I should get a few issues. Firstly, I'll just quickly save it. Now, if I go run compile, oh, that surprised me. It's worked pretty much right away. Something that you need to do for best compatibility is change this compiler directive at the top here, because when it talks to the API, you'll notice in here it says mode Delphi. In here it says mode object FPC, which means object free Pascal. So at the moment, the compiler is going to work in object free Pascal mode. We want it to work in Delphi mode, which basically means that it's more compatible with the various terminologies used in here. So to do that, we just use mode Delphi, just as it's written there basically. And the H plus or $H plus value is also important. That means that all the standard strings within free Pascal are of unlimited length. If you don't have that in, you can find that your strings are cut short at 255, which might be an issue with certain values. Okay, so just run that again, compile. So what that should now have done is it should have created a DLL, which it has, called project1.dll. Now what I can also do is I can use debugging within this. So if I go to project options and choose debugging, under where it says generate info for the debugger, if you change that to dwarf with sets, you can use the debugger to effectively set breakpoints in here, which means when it runs, you can gradually go through it line by line and see what information is in the variables. Now you might wonder how that works when it's an extension for XWays Forensics. Well, the good news there is that you can use the run parameters, which basically means that this code will automatically run via whatever executable I specify in here. So under host application, if I navigate in here to where I've got XWays Forensics, choose the 64-bit of XWays Forensics because I'm using the 64-bit of Lazarus, so my extension is 64-bit. If I now go run, what should hopefully happen is XWays Forensics will run. Which it has. So it's opened my demo case and a forensic image. So if I now just explore this recursively, remember that our extension that we've made was designed to run via a right click only. If I go right click, run extensions, get rid of the old one, add the new one, so choose that, click OK. This is not an extension DLL. What have I done there? Okay, good example of what might have gone wrong straight away. Let's go back. What have I done wrong there? Let me pause it and work that out 1 minute. Okay, welcome back, guys. Sorry about that. I had a moment of panic there when it didn't work, and then I realised it's because at the bottom here I haven't done my exports section, which is the all-important bit. So in here, the concept of exporting a function in a DLL is fairly mainstream, and it basically enables you to tell the DLL which functions can be called from in here. You can add further ones if needs be, but for this particular demonstration, these are the ones that will be required. Okay, so if I now, just let me stop X-Ray Forensics a minute. Just wait for it to stop, which it should do any second now, hopefully. Yeah, so it's now stopped. So now if I recompile, now it works. Just out of interest, I forgot to explain earlier. If I take, for example, that out, as in take out the library for the API, I don't think it will compile. No, it won't, because it's looking for functions like this one, which are specifically stated within the API only. So if I put it back, now it will work. Okay, so now it's compiled. Now, hopefully, when we run this time, we might be able to do what we meant to do earlier. So if I just select some files, and if I now right-click this and go Run Extensions, hopefully it will work. Where is it? Desktop. And it does. So at least you now know that if you get that error message that you got earlier, it means it's because you've either not done your XT init properly, or you've not put your exports in at the bottom. If I press this ellipsis here for this selected extension, it gives me the information that we put in the XT about in a nice little dialog window. And now if I run this, what should happen is for each of these selected items, it will show in the messages window the file name and the file size, which it's done really, really quickly, less than a second. So it's looked up each file name. It won't necessarily do them in the order that they're in the directory browser, by the way. Again, X-Ray Forensics decides in which order it will process each item, not necessarily in the order that's selected within the directory browser. But for each one, it's looked up the size, it's spat it out as bytes, it's added them all together in the total data bytes read or whatever variable it was, and it's put the time in. Now if I try and run this extension another way, for example via the volume snapshot, it shouldn't work. So now it's given me that error message. Please execute this extension by right-clicking one or more selected files only, not via the RVS or the main menu. Thank you. So that's the message that I put in the where's the function gone? It's up there at the top, I thought. Yeah. In here, so message box enables you to show the message box within the main window of X-Ray Forensics, and there's the message that's been put out. And then it returns result 3, which, as you can see, it then stops the execution. Right, what else can I tell you? There's probably lots more I could tell you, but other than the tips I think I've already given, I might just end up idly rambling on. The biggest thing is to basically read all the information really well, try and understand as best you can what it is you're trying to do, and these various values that are returned. It's interesting to note, for example, XWF open item, where we call XTProcessItem, you can, for each item, essentially open it, which passes a handle, which you can then do stuff with. So it might be that you want to copy all the information within the file into your own buffer and iterate through it, looking for a certain pattern of bytes or a certain signature or certain characters, whatever it may be. And in the case of XWF open item, when you call this, you can essentially ask it to pass you the handle in a way that enables you to do different things. And some new ones have been added really very recently. And so in version 19.9, which I think at the time of writing is still in beta, or it might only have just come out, there's got things like convert to PDF format on the fly. So you could open each item, so which could be an email, it could be a Word document, it could be whatever. And then you can, if you pass 0200, you can have it convert to a PDF file, which you can then save out in some kind of memory stream, a file stream or something of that nature. If you use open item, you've also got to use close, which basically tells you close the volume that was opened with the open volume, or an item that was opened with open item. Yeah, so you can use close to close both an item that's been opened up here, or close a volume if you've opened a volume for some particular specific reason. And then once you've opened an item, you can read, and you can read the content of it into buffers, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these are interlinked, and they're designed to be called sometimes in combination with each other. Yeah, so that's probably about as much as I would want to go into in this format. It's not very easy conveying something like this through a kind of a live demo video setup, but hopefully that will help some of you get a bit of a head start with what can seem quite an intimidating and bewildering experience. I know it certainly has taken me a long time to get to grips with this, because I'm not one of these programmers that can just look at things and it magically just makes sense to them. It does take a lot of work and a lot of time to learn how to do this with any degree of fluidity. And as you saw from my demonstration just then, it's easy to miss bits out and forget things. But if you keep in mind what I've shown you in this, which is that you need to have these core functions, XTinit, XTPrepare, XTProcessItem, and XTDone, XTFinalize and XTAbout, I think are optional from memory. But with those just core functions, and especially with XTProcessItem, you can go on to do quite a lot. And I've created several extensions within my employer, which I'm hoping to be able to open source soon, and I'll somehow communicate that when they are available in an open source sense. And it might be that if you're for example working in government or whatever, and you would like help with developing an extension, we might be able to assist you depending on what the request is, and various other factors. But those of you who know me will know how to ask me that question. So if you think I might be able to help you, then by all means get in touch. Okay, I think that is it. Hopefully it won't be 7 or 8 months until I do the next one. I might try and follow this up depending on what the reception is, with something a bit more advanced potentially. If you've got any comments or questions, then by all means put them to me, and I'll try to help if I can. Okay, I think that's about it. If I can work out how to stop this, then I will do. Okay, bye.